Thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak today. It's really fun to be on this panel, and I'm glad that my mom didn't take me out of the candy shop and let me pick as much candy as I wanted. It's especially fun to be here with artists who I have such terrific respect for. And I wanted to say at the outset that one of the often implicit, it's taken to be an implicit goal of science is to demystify the magic of our experience of the world. And I just want to lay it to rest that that is not at all my goal. I'm interested in that magic of perception, and that's in fact what got me into the business of neuroscience to start with. And if an analogy helps, it's like a winemaker who becomes more and more in love with winemaking the more and more they know about it, because the more they know about it, the more mysterious it becomes. And for me, that's very much my obsession and fascination with color. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully a much longer discussion with Tauba at the end and then into the future about the ways in which, from our different perspectives, we can start to gain traction on what this problem might mean and enrich mutually our understanding of it. And I'm looking forward to your questions, too. So from a neuroscientific point of view, the reason I like color so much is that it's a very powerful tool for understanding how we take in information, process it, and produce some thought or action. And this is something that I think we often take for granted. We can, famously at this institution, David Marr said, to some graduate students, I want you to spend the summer, and we now know how the visual system works because we figured out what the spectral sensitivities of the cones are, and Hubel Weasel have shown us how primary visual cortex works, so go and make a machine that does it. The graduate students went away, and then they came back summer later and said, well, turns out it's kind of more complicated than that. And our machine can't even recognize like a hand. And the story, I think, reveals the great computational challenge that we face the challenge that the visual system faces, and moreover, it's the challenge we face in trying to unpack it. So the problem is that we're all endowed with this thing that enables us to see and experience the world, and then we have to try and use this thing, this nervous system, to figure itself out. And it's what Nancy Canrisher describes the non-problem of the tow truck towing the tow truck. It's not really a problem. It's just difficult because we take it for granted. We take for granted the fact that this thing works so effortless. If I ask my nephew how you see, he says, I open my eyes, dummy. I mean, Uncle Bevel, that's not a problem. And color, for me, is the epitome of this challenge within vision. And I think you've started to get a sense of where that comes from. When we think of color, we think of red, green, blue, yellow, and maybe a few others. And somehow it's as if these things are so perfectly endowed that we're all effortlessly able to see them, that those things must be out there in the world. And this really is the challenge that neuroscience faces, which is to understand that your ability to make that assignment so effortless, to see color so effortlessly, belies an enormously sophisticated neural machine that makes that possible. So the fact that you can say, oh, that's red, it must be really easy, that difficulty is what has led philosophers and scientists to ascribe redness to something out there as opposed to something that's computed in here. OK, so that's the sort of background about why I study color, because it's a really fabulous system for understanding how you transform these peripheral, underdetermined signals into something of behavioral relevance. OK, so today I'd like to talk about, to take up two questions, which is first that big question I laid out, which is, well, what is the computational goal of color? What is color for? We've heard a few little tidbits here and there. Caroline mentioned at the beginning some ideas, and I'd like to pick them up. And then the second part, I'd like to talk a little bit about how these goals are implemented in the brain, which is, I might get a chance to talk a bit about some of my research. OK, so it turns out that for most objects, color is not at all useful for recognizing objects. In this graph, it's showing the reaction times for recognizing line drawings versus colored photographs. And it turns out, actually, you're a little bit quicker at recognizing line drawings. So your initial impulse that I had, at least, is debunked that color helps in recognizing objects. It might be true for certain kinds of objects, but we'll get there. Okay, and it turns out that for most objects, if you remove all of the value information, that is the black and white information that you might encode in a black and white photograph, and just have color, that pure color information is insufficient. It's neither necessary nor sufficient for you to be able to recognize many kinds of objects. And in this case, it's a face, and the face is of my friend and mentor, David Hubel. And it's for this reason, I think, that many vision scientists have steered clear of color, because it doesn't look like you need color really to do anything. It's like, well, it's sort of an add-on. And that's where, you know, I'm trying to change the field a little bit, but it's an uphill battle. All right. So color is used to recognize some kinds of objects. It can be useful under very degraded image conditions. For example, in this situation, as shown by Pawan Sinha and his colleagues, to see, for example, the boundaries between the hair and the face in a very blurry photograph. This is Lady Diana, and those color cues help you segment her face, and they do so even under degraded, especially under degraded image conditions. But here the color is irrelevant, as shown in the false colored image on the far right. Okay, but this seems like, why did the visual system go to all this trouble to give you color to do this thing? I mean, it kind of, when I read this paper as this is the best evidence we have to date for why we have color, I thought, that seems to miss the point. And here I will just footnote all of what Taube talked about, which is when you experience the world, color is a lot of stuff. You really like it. We spend a lot of money buying color TVs. We spend a lot of money buying Taube's paintings because they move us. There's nothing in them. It's like colored spray paint. I mean, really? Right? So it's doing something else. And this is really the piece that I'm trying to bring to the neuroscientific community, which is to take seriously the fact that color is doing something that we haven't been very good at quantifying it, figuring out. And I'm not going to tell you that we have an answer. I'm just saying my guess is that there's something down that road, and we probably need to keep poking around to get there. I think this image does give us some clues. So Sinha and his colleagues don't talk about it, but if you look at the image on the far right, that false colored image, I don't know, when I first looked at this, she seems a little sick. Doesn't she seem a little ill? And that feeling, like it hits you right in your gut right away, where you're like, something's not right about that picture. And it's almost pre-verbal. Like I couldn't figure out where this information came from until I went to sleep and woke up the next day, and I was like, it's because it's false colored. It looks like really weird. And this, of course, feeds into the use of color filters on your Instagram account, where you want to have a particular kind of image quality, because it's got a really deep emotional impact on you. And in particular, color as a metric is often diagnostic for certain kinds of changes in health status. So first aid people are trained to look at complexion changes because they can tell you with with high immediacy whether or not someone is sick or not. And indeed, it turns out that for certain objects for which color is diagnostic, if you change the color, you delay the reaction time. So I think now we're starting to see that color isn't really a tool for recognizing generic objects. It's for recognizing objects for which color is behaviorally relevant. And now I think we're going to start to get some traction on the problem. Okay, so that reaction time argument is supported by another attribute of color, which is that color facilitates object pop-out or object recognition. To be able to discriminate the twos in this image is much easier when they're colored than they're not. And this is well known in visual psychophysics. It's exploited all the time. And the people who are using this as a tool to train their animals or their subjects spend very little time figuring out why this works. Like, why does color work so well as pop-out? And I think we're starting to see how they could come together. Okay, so the point that I'd like to make for the first part of the talk about what is the computational goal of color really is boiled down to two pieces. One is, sure, color might be useful for segmenting objects. That is, for discriminating where those boundaries happen so that you can identify an object's shape. That's a pretty time-consuming task, and color looks like it could provide some help in doing that. But more critically, I think, is that color helps facilitate the rapid detection of behaviorally relevant objects. And I think it's that evolutionary incentive, if you will, that makes and confers on color this thing that we all experience, which is why you're here. You like it. You're interested in it. And I think this is evidence of some kind of selective pressure. So to just hammer home how these two things could work, we've got segmentation cues for which the color is not important, and then surface properties for which color is important. And I like this idea because it takes seriously this idea that color could be a reward. And in fact, there's evidence in industry that color emotion associations are highly trainable, and we exploit them. Various industries exploit them all the time. Artists have, of course, exploited this too, to be able to liberate from the representation of shape color to do a wildly different sorts of things. So here it isn't being used to encode shape information, but to do a bunch of other stuff. So what is color for? Well, I think it helps in facilitating object recognition, but it also subserves a whole host of functions that touch on many aspects of perception and cognition, including things like emotion, reward, and for those of you that have little girls, I have a daughter who's 3 years old. She's obsessed with pink. That happened relatively recently. I think it's even a very important cue for social cognition. OK, so Talbot talked a little bit about the three cone types. There they are up the top. The first surprise about color vision was that these three cone types don't actually predict red, green, and blue. In fact, their peak spectral sensitivity of the so-called red curve is sitting over the green. In order to see long wavelength light as red, you have to subtract two cone types in order to be able to discriminate long wavelength light as red. And this tells us right away that there's something very important in terms of the neural machinery that's supporting the extraction of color from those three cone types. And because this is MIT, I feel like I can show some math. The beauty of studying color is that we can determine with very high precision from the spectral reflectance function of an object the relative cone activations of every single scene just by taking the dot product of that spectral emission function and the three cone type absorption spectra. The problem is that that doesn't tell you what color something is. And if there's any doubt in that, I want you to take out your red-green color filters and look through the red filter. And look at no cheating. We've got to do this relatively quickly because she's telling me I only have 5 minutes. But we can go on forever, can't we? She told me I had 20, and I've only been talking for 12, so. All right, so look through the red filter, no cheating, okay, absolutely no cheating. I want you to tell me, what is the color of the garment of the woman at the window? White, gray. Okay, take away the color filter, and it is, of course, red. Okay, so what's striking about this is the paradox of Monge. It's been around for hundreds of years. That red is unaffected by the color filter. The light has already been filtered by the paint, as it were, to extract everything but long wavelength energy. So the long wavelength energy that's going through your red filter with and without the color filter is exactly unchanged. What this tells you is that your perception of color is actually contingent on a whole host of operations that you take completely for granted. And these operations have to do with the spectral and spatial, temporal, chromatic context in which this image is seen. A simple way of characterizing this would be as a chromatic opponent mechanism in which that thing is seen as red because the background is decidedly not red. So here, your assignment of an object's color is contingent on an implicit calculation that your visual system is making about its relative redness in a given context. And for artists, this isn't a surprise. The reddest thing then would be a red thing on a green or a bluish-green background. But from a neuroscientific point of view, what this tells us is that red is a computation made by the brain as it attempts to come up with a label that is stable against space and time. And I like this sort of from a poetic point of view as the counterpart to Taubes' argument about how time is implicitly involving the changes of three dimensions. Here, actually, the goal of color seems to be to actually hold the thing steady, to protect it against the changes that seem to be inevitable. So how does the brain do that? I don't have too much time to go into it. Suffice to say that my colleagues and I spent about 10 years looking at the neural mechanisms for spatial color contrast and discovered in primary visual cortex that there are neurons that are capable of performing exactly the operation that is required. Importantly, these mechanisms happen in your cerebral cortex, not in your retina. So we already have evidence that the calculation of color, your perception of color, is contingent on something downstream of what's happening in the retina. So the next time someone tells you that color is a retinal thing, you say, nuh-uh, color is a cortical thing that is the interpretation of signals received by the brain in the cortex. One of the surprising things that our results revealed is how, over what small a spatial scale these chromatic interactions take place. The extent from the science shows us that it's on the order of half a degree, if not less. Okay, so what that means is in great demonstrations like this, pictures like this, where Joseph Elbers has painted with a single color stripe, a stripe to appear two different colors. His genius was in the clever interplay of the backgrounds to have that stripe appear two different colors. That comes about because of a very local unconscious interaction between this stripe and the immediate background. And to test that idea, we could simply get rid of that interaction with a white buffer, and it turns out that you can recover a stable percept of the stripe just by doing so. When I was a Radcliffe Fellow, I had an opportunity to look at the works of some great painters, included amongst them is Matisse, and I was delighted to discover that he does the same thing. And you might ask, why is he doing this? Did he just run out of paint? I think everybody, he was a rich man. He had lots of paint. I think he could have finished it if he'd wanted. He's doing this because this is protecting the color of the marks against these color contrast changes that are introduced every time you put one color next to another. Okay, these changes can be really dramatic. This is here, let's have audience participation. What are these colors? Oh, dear. More coffee. Okay, ready? Great. So this is an image from Beau Lotto. It turns out that physically that patch is identical to that patch, and we know it's so because you can just eclipse the background, and it turns out in both those cases it's gray. So you can see why painting color is traumatic, because if you set out to paint this cube to start with, you would naturally start by mixing, I would, blue paint for what looks like the blue square and yellow paint for what looks like the yellow square. Blue there and yellow there, but in fact you would be wrong. Okay, so this is, I think, why things like paint by number kits are so much fun, because you're instructed to paint this thing in the sky, and then over the course of the painting, as if by some sort of visual joke, that thing turns out to look right. Whereas at the beginning you're like, this sky's black. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so in the last few minutes I want to turn to some science from my lab and others just to start to get a handle on how it is that we do all of these other things. So color is one little piece, but I think actually it's not a big enough term. As we discover more and more things that color is for, we're going to become more and more in need of a bigger arsenal of ways of talking about it and thinking about it. And I think we're just at the beginning stages of doing that. So downstream of what's called primary visual cortex, this extra striate part of the brain, this is a huge chunk of the cerebral cortex, and it turns out that a lot of it is involved in color. So these are just patches of brain that show greater fMRI activation to color versus black-white. And if we record the activity of single neurons within one of these little blobs, each blob has hundreds of thousands of neurons, this is the response pattern for one such cell and for another cell here. And to summarize all of the neurophysiology, both these cells respond optimally to green. And they happen to sit right next to each other. We discovered that if we record many of these cells next to each other, the cells neighboring each other have a sequential progression in their color preferences, going from, in this case, a kind of yellow through red, that's an outlier, red, bluish, red, and purple. And this provided the first evidence for little microorganization of a chromatopic map. So one of the goals of my lab, which sort of comes full symmetry with some of the questions that Tauba is asking, is this idea of how color is organized doesn't seem to be out there in the physical world. It seems to be actually the way in which that physical world is implemented in the brain, and maybe we can reverse engineer our model of how color is represented by looking at the organization of color circuits in the brain. In the last few seconds, I want to just talk about what's happening down here. So all that I talked about, those little color maps, are all back here in the brain. There's primary visual cortex. This represents progressively more advanced stages of processing. And you can see there's lots of parts of the brain here that are involved in color. I was very struck by this sort of inhomogeneity down the temporal lobe. And we decided to map in the same, these are actually in monkeys, but it turns out to be the same in humans, the responses to faces. And they provide a very nice functional landmark. And you can see, actually, the face maps. This is in a sagittal view, where the eyes would be looking to that direction. You can see that the faces form a parallel, separate track for colors, which provides very nice evidence that, in support of this, one of the original observations I showed you today, that color information is not used to do things like face processing. Like, we've got different circuits that are doing that. And we've spent, as a vision community, a lot of time looking at these circuits. And what these results reveal is there's a whole lot of brain that's involved in color. Maybe we should spend some time thinking about what that part of brain is doing, and we might come closer to understanding a little bit about what supports all of this interest in color. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.
In exhaustion or in frustration, or just to refresh eyes strained from being trained too long on my computer screen, I shut them and rub my palms against my closed eyelids. A psychedelic thrill and burst of cardinal, celadon, and ochre projects itself on the cinema screen of my visual cortex. Such cross-modal crossing of signals in which haptic and visual sensory inputs gets crossed is a sort of hallucinatory spectacle that led Goethe to posit a corporal subjectivity that made a clean cut with Newtonian optics. Seeing color was no longer a privileged form of knowledge, but also an inquiry into, an embodied experiment of, and in the intermixing of sensory organs and sensation. We carry the weight of such romanticism when we think of colors as mere variables and an aid to understanding mathematics. And the history of mathematical knowledge and its relation to manifestly embodied sensory practice is what I think and write about. That is, there is nothing specific to color when it appears in mathematical problems and theorem. It is merely one factor, an entirely arbitrary one, by which mathematician can mark some sort of difference. But does it? Color might be arbitrary, yet its regular appearance in mathematics as a way of assigning variables suggests precisely that its role is not random. In 1957, at the height of mathematical formalization, Vannevar Bush, initiator of the Manhattan Project and champion of the National Science Foundation, sent a letter to mathematician Solomon Golomb. Golomb recently published a short column in Scientific American reporting on a proof that a particular carving of a checkboard with pieces of particular shape was impossible. The proof was arrived at by coloring each tile on the board. Bush naively asked Golomb whether the proof still hold if the board hasn't been colored. Golomb laughed off Bush's question wondering how such a powerful champion of science could know so little as to think that color mattered to mathematics. A mathematician makes a similar joke, this time at an historian's expense. One evening, a mathematician and a historian amble across campus in the waning light, discussing the four-color map theorem. So the gist of the theorem is that for any possible map, one needs no more than 4 colors so that any 2 countries sharing a border have different colors. The butt of the joke is the historian who responds, oh yeah, blue, yellow, pink, and green, isn't it? So imagine the resounding and deprecating laughter of the mathematicians here. Of course, the colors themselves are immaterial. What matters is the formal notion of mapping a sort of cartographic distance, isn't it? So let me quiet the raucous laughter of this mathematician with another sort of story about mathematics and color. Diagnosed with inoperable and metastatic cancer, Ludwig Wittgenstein traveled to Vienna, where he began thinking about color. He reported that his impending death cleared his head, and that for the first time in years, he felt once again able to do philosophy. Wittgenstein's abiding interest in color dates, as noted earlier, to his earlier work, in which he elucidated both the notion of color space and the color exclusion problems, which I wouldn't dare delve into today. But in his final days, his thinking changed significantly, and after his death, a sheaf of paper simply titled Remarks on Color was discovered on top of his desk in Cambridge University. Of course, this is not it. This is just some artists reworking of the book. Wittgenstein's right that these remarks are neither about color as simply psychology or phenomenology, but instead, quote, here we have a sort of mathematics of color. What he meant was that rather than being something to be classified and ordered by mathematics, or a handy representational tool for making variables in mathematics, the bond between math and color was much deeper. Indeed, they might be thought of as models for one another. Perhaps more broadly, they are both models for how we know what we know. They are both, to use his language games, and as such, description of a proof of a color is always by necessity insufficient. Quote, can one describe higher mathematics to someone without thereby teaching it to him? To describe the game of tennis to someone is not to teach it to him, and vice versa. On the other hand, someone who didn't know what tennis is and learns how to play then knows what it is. So to paraphrase, no one can describe the color blue to a colorblind person, and like tennis, in order to know what math is, one must learn how to play. So to extend his thinking one step further, despite the seeming failure of an intersubjective grasp of what we mean by color or by mathematical object, we treat such categories as natural ones that precedes our own experience of them, our own attempts to tenuously grasp at a private understanding of, say, transfinite numbers or cerulean blue, precisely because such language has already been appended to them. Their terminological identity may stabilize these concepts as kinds, but they're woefully insufficient at gesturing toward an experience of them. So returning to Wittgenstein language, words can merely, quote, characterize the impression of a surface over which our glance wanders. This is not a theory of color a la Goethe, nor a logic of color, any more than it is about a psychology of perception. It is rather, as Wittgenstein says, a mathematics of color. It speaks equally to the color of mathematics. So let me fast forward 50 years to another dead philosopher of color, David Foster Wallace. In 2001, Wallace published a short piece on Wittgenstein, which later appeared in Hesse's collection, Consider the Lobster. Lowering the tone somewhat, Wallace invoked the teenage stoner. Now, I'm going to quote this passage in its entirety because I think it's worth it. Eating Chips Ahoy and staring very intently at the television's network PGA event, for instance, the adolescent pot smoker is struck by the ghastly possibility that, for example, what he sees as the color green and what other people call the color green may in fact not be the same color experience at all. The fact that both he and someone else call Pebble Beach fairways green and Spotlight Go signal green appears to guarantee only that there is similar consistency in their color experience of fairways and go lights, not that actual subjective quality of this color experience is the same. It could be that what the adolescent pot smoker experiences as green, everyone else experiences as blue, and what we mean by the word blue is what he means by green, etc., etc., until the whole line of thinking gets so vexed and exhausting that the adolescent pot smoker ends up slumped, cramp-strewn, and paralyzed in his chair. But rather than succumbing to such cramp-strewn solipsism, the philosophy dropout Wallace resurrects the spectre of the dying Wittgenstein to argue precisely the opposite, that language is always built on consensus, and thus can never be private, apolitical, or lacking in ideology. This is true of pain, of color blue, and of notably transfinite numbers too. But I've gotten ahead of myself. Allow me then to circle back to question how the colors of mathematics pertain to space and its higher dimensions. Let us begin with a little paradox Poincaré asks us in 1905. Beings whose minds were made as ours, and with senses like ours, but without any preliminary education, might receive from a suitably chosen external world impressions which would lead them to construct a geometry other than that of Euclid, and to localize the phenomena of this external world in a non-Euclidean space, or even a space of 4 dimensions. Adamantly and conventionalist, Poincaré sought to dispense with both the experimentalist and an a priori conception of space. Can we imagine 4-dimensional space, Poincaré inquired? And he's quick to respond that, yes, indeed, we can. Instead of imagining beings inhabiting 4-dimensional space, Poincaré asked that we instead imagine ourselves with slightly altered visions. Quote, "Two red sensations affecting the same point of the retina will be regarded as identical only if they are accompanied by the same sensation of convergence and also by the same sensation of effort of accommodation." End quote. But what if experience had taught us otherwise? What if the sensation of accommodation and the sensation of convergence by which we see 3 dimensions do not supplement one another? Then, 2 visual sensations of red would be distinguished, and, quote, "the whole visual space would have 4 dimensions." So this thought experiment leads Poincaré to suggest that it suffices to fit over the eyes glasses of suitable construction to make space have 4 dimensions. End quote. Taba, that might answer your earlier question of what we need to do. Whereas Poincaré's investigation into the 4th dimension questioned the relation of mathematicians' geometrical space to their perceptual space, some of his contemporaries thought to actively bring the two together. So to come full circle back to the way Carolyn ended her talk, I'm going back to Charles Hinton, coiner of the word Tesseract, who was perhaps the greatest popularizer of the 4th dimension at the turn of the century. He believed that investigating higher dimension would lead to an understanding of a higher being than ours. Hinton was wrote profusely on the 4th dimension. With knowledge of higher space, he mused, quote, "they come into our ken boundless possibilities. All those things may be real, whereof saints and philosophers have dreamt." To do so, he constructed a colorful model of cubes in hopes of teaching his fellow men how to perceive higher dimensions. And I want to read some of his instructions to give you an idea of how they went. The square of vermilion traces a pale green cube and ends in an Indian red square. For example, another one. In this square, he has 2 lines which he had before. The blue line with gold and buff points, the deep yellow line with light blue and red points. Or finally, the black square traces a brick red cube. So if you feel confused, you're not alone. When Martin Gardner years later mentioned Hinton in one of his Scientific American columns, a worried reader responded, quote, "A shudder ran down my spine when I read your reference to Hinton's cube. I nearly got hooked on them myself in the 1920s. Please believe me when I say that they are completely mind-destroying." And since I've already mentioned David Foster Wallace, let me invoke him one last time, as he too noted the destructive power of thinking about the fourth dimension. Quote, "There is something I know, which is that the spatial dimension beyond the big three exists. I can even construct a tesseract or a hypercube out of cardboard. I know all of this, just as you probably do. But now, try to really picture it, concretely. You can feel, almost immediately, a strain at the very root of yourself, the first pop threads of a mind starting to give in at the seams. So now, we arrived at an account of mathematics and of color that are mutually reliant on one another, and more so, of the intensely social acts of experience, the insufficient yet wholly necessary work of description, and the socially enabled yet sometimes lonely experience of learning how to prove, to play tennis, and how to see in trained and careful manner. Thank you.
We are now going to sit up here and we are going to take some questions or some answers. Maybe that's where we should begin. So just sit where you like. And here's where I peer through the stage lighting to see, yeah, here's a good.
I was wondering if you could address a bit, especially since art inspires visceral reaction, the relationship of colors to emotion, or for that matter, where a spectrum of synesthesia comes in as color intersects with other senses.
Okay, now I broke the rules because I was supposed to wait for him to get a microphone. But I'm going to repeat the question, and then you'll know if I received your message correctly. So I heard 3 points. So one is how artists capture a certain emotional intensity of color, and could the panelists, could the participants here think about that emotional valence? And then sliding into questions of synesthesia where 2 different senses cross modalities.
But also, how is it that we react to color in emotional ways? And also, is that cross-cultural? Do all cultures react to colors?
Here's your microphone. So, why is it that we react emotionally?
Why is it that we react to color in visceral ways, which is sometimes the intent of an artist? Right. Is there some relationship to that to some sort of synesthetic reaction? And is the reaction to color cross-culturally the same, or something we learn?
Oh, there are about 20 questions in there. That's great. That's great. So who wants to start with that one?
Seems like your area to start.
Okay, I'll launch in. You want me to move that direction? Oh. So he's waving at me. I'm having a synesthetic experience.
What's happening?
Just plow ahead.
Just plow ahead. All right. Okay, so question 1. Why is it that we have, or how do we have a visceral or emotional reaction to color? Answer, from me, I don't know. But there is some nice neurological evidence that speaks in support of this widely reported anecdote. For example, patients who suffer an acquired cerebral achromatopsia, that is, a color blindness associated with damage to the cortex, attendant to that is often a depression, which is not true in many other kinds of acquired perceptual deficits. So people who lose, for example, the ability to see faces don't go around bemoaning the fact they can't see faces. They just can't see faces. People who lose the ability to see motion, they probably shouldn't drive a car. They have difficulty pouring cups of tea, but they don't go around being depressed and unhappy. So there is some organic basis, I think, for this assertion. There's some lovely work from Helen Mayberg's group who used deep brain stimulation in intractable depressed patients in whom she had identified particular brain areas that were either hyper or hypoactive compared to normal. The logic here was a kind of micro scale of electroconvulsive therapy, and it's done in the awake patient in the OR. And strikingly and surprisingly, one of the things these patients reported was a partial alleviation of their depression, but an intensification of the colors. It's a footnote in a neuron paper. I can send it to you if you're interested. No one knows what to make of it, except that, yes, the answer does seem to be that there is some connection between the experience that you have of being viscerally moved by color and a neural basis.
Color my world.
Color your world. And I'll let off the stage to someone to talk about the other questions.
I mean, I can't really address with any authority the cultural question, but I would guess that the answer is yes, because I've experienced my relationship to different colors change, and different color combinations specifically, to change over the course of my life. So that tells me that it's a plastic kind of taste.
And it's associational.
Yeah.
So historically, pink was considered way too strong for girls in Belgium in 1920, right? So the current pinkification of femaleness is a very contemporary phenomenon, and not, it's not hardwired, right? So.
And one way I think people have tried to attack the question is to say, well, maybe it isn't the specific color association, but maybe it's something second order about the valence of that emotion. So it is true cross-culturally that red is a pretty important thing. And you have some evidence, from your experience, red is used for passion and love. It's also stop signs. It's also anger. So it's not the direction of the sign, positive or negative, but maybe the arrow length, that this is a powerful thing. And there's some evidence that cross-culturally that is preserved.
And so there was a final piece about synesthesia, and I'll just deliver.
She knows
sorry,
all about
I don't know all
synesthesia.
about synesthesia, but I'll deliver some findings from a conference that I attended, in which certain neuroscientists are theorizing that we are all synesthetes when we are born, and that part of the cross-modality is kind of pruned with synaptic pruning, which is a very important stage of human development. Some theorize that synesthetes are regressed, which is a very contentious position, but that they have failed to develop this pruning in a certain sense. So it's fair game for many, many theories. And what I find interesting as an art historian is when it was the most cool to be a synesthete, right? So someone like Kandinsky probably wasn't, but deeply wanted to be. And that is interesting, right? When these sensory confusions are themselves deeply desired, I think has some cultural information in it that is a lot of fun. And of course, reading is synesthete. Sorry?
I think it would be torture to be a synesthete, like in the true sense of the word, to have it would just be like being bombarded with so many stimuli.
But think about the fact that synesthesia, roughly speaking, is historically identified as a pathology when literacy is extended to the most people. In other words, reading is enforced synesthesia. You're looking at a strange, abstract, black shape on a white background, and you're being told, mama. In other words, that this should stimulate in your mind a sound, right? So the fact that it's identified as a pathology at the very moment that people are being asked to read, and that the most common pattern of synesthesia is a cross-modal, I see this letter and it's red, or I see this number and it's crying. This visual aural crossing is just very suggestive. I don't think they've done enough work on it, but it's a very interesting nexus of cultural, technological, and brain phenomena.
Germane to this discussion is that 90% of synesthetes have a confusion with color and something else. So you could conceivably have, touch and hearing, and they sort of exist sometimes, but most of them involves color.
Right.
Are we allowed to ask each other questions? Or is
sure.
that,
I'm wondering, are there other questions coming from the multi-purpose, from the outside rooms? I mean, no, not yet. Okay. So let's do one question that you have for the panel, and then I'll go to David's question over here.
I have a question. I think what's interesting is this argument, and I want to hear whether or not you think it's valid from an art historical point of view, because I have no way of evaluating it, which is that the desire to be a synesthete came at the same time that there was this crisis in what constituted good art, and this provided a kind of scientific basis or a scientific way of saying you were better, your art was better than someone else's art. And if that's true, I think it's interesting because it seems to be relevant today with this proliferation of an art market, and we're like, I don't know what's good art. Do you know what's good art? I mean,
just
Tauba,
ask
what's
me.
good art?
I'll tell you. Just ask Tauba.
Tauba, what's good art? I mean, it's like, I don't know.
I think, the historical question of when synesthesia becomes attractive is super interesting and has lots of different parameters that we'd have to untangle. But certainly the position of modernism as something that wanted to radically question the stability of perception, the location of perception, the purpose of art, all of those things were being questioned. Now, the fact that in the case of Kandinsky, his first synesthesia experiences with Wagner, and then his second major synesthesia experiences with, Schoenberg, suggests that he's not precisely trying to validate what he's doing through these comparisons. He's actually feeling a change in music through color, if that makes any sense. So he's using color in a way to model his own experience of music. And that, maybe there's a sense there of transferring values from one domain to another. So, David.
So I do have a question for Tauba about modeling of four-dimensional space, but in relation to color. And so I'm interested in whether you have experimented with, or maybe it's more of a speculation about how color, not necessarily how it works, but maybe how it is in some way systematic within a 4D space. Because you had been showing us 4D space, and you were also showing us a lot of different 3D color models. And so I'm just starting to grasp the possibility of color being distributed in 4D space. And I'm wondering if your work has gone in that direction.
I thought about making, when we first talked about me coming here, we talked about me trying to model a proposal for a four-dimensional color space. But I abandoned that idea for a number of reasons. First of all, that fourth axis would not be terribly different than, it would be sort of, I guess, yellowish if I was going to use the tetrachromat as a starting point, the human tetrachromat. And I also thought 4 wasn't enough, because that's still starting with that purely retinal tri-stimulus model, and as Bevel said so much better than I said in my talk, that really doesn't account for so much of what happens after the retina. So I really think we would need this Albers model that has every color next to every single other color, and I have no idea how to do that. So I decided to go in a more reductive direction towards the weaving, which was my gesture towards that.
Thank you. Okay, so can we get the mic to the man whose shirt is striped?
My question is for, is for Bevel, is that right? You seem to be interested in the fact that, or focusing on the fact that color was related to the texture and the thingness of things. And I find that really interesting, and I want to make one observation and then a question, I guess I put it that way. A few years ago, I had done some work looking at how many colors do you need, and I'd taken, I don't know, quite a few hundred pictures and converted them to color space, and then done a cluster analysis. And you could do really a pretty good job with 24, so your box of Crayola crayons, if you pick them correctly, does a pretty good job.
Of capturing what?
Of representing the colors in the real world. There are not very many colors in the real world. And I find that really interesting from an evolutionary point of view as to how the brain evolves, okay? And that's, okay. Second part of it is because of the thingness of things, children with cerebral palsy have no motor control to be able to identify things. Have you ever looked at how, with functional MRI, what goes on in the visual cortex with people who have physical motor skills problems?
I mean, the short answer is no. I think your observation about 24 colors as a basis set is fascinating. I mean, there are people here actually who will be speaking tomorrow. Josh Tenenbaum is one of them that has some very nice thoughts on how it is that we, as a developing brain, you know, having a developing brain, build that brain to acquire and develop new knowledge, which requires building a new concept. And I think of colors, the acquisition of a new color term to your vocabulary, as that process embodied in a very concrete way. So that you've arrived at 24, I think it's fairly enlightened and advanced. I would say most cultures actually have a much more limited set in which maybe only 3 or 4 are necessary to capture all of the space. And I've been working in collaboration with Ted Gibson here at MIT with an ancient population in the Amazon basin who seem to use color in a way that's much more primitive in some sense, but captures in its heart what it is that I think you started with, which is we use color to identify surfaces. Like, it isn't a great chance that orange, the color, is the fruit, and that emerald is the color of emeralds, and you can go through a whole battery of your favorite color terms, and there's a surface that is, you know, rust. It's rust. I think from my point of view, that's interesting because it tells us something about what we use color for, what the problem is that the visual system is trying to solve. But the difficulty is, how do you get at how you turn what are retinal signals, which have nothing to do with rust or any of these color category boundaries, into something that is this discrete category, this discrete concept. And we right now have very little idea how to do that or think about it.
And I would just add that there's a beautiful book by John Gage called Color and Culture. And he writes about the Greek color naming system, which at first was terribly confusing to the translators because Hector was being dragged through Troy by his blue hair, right? And Gage talks about how the Greeks actually had terms for luminance that were not connected to what we would think of as chroma, okay? So Hector's Kianos hair was lustrous, dark, almost iridescent. So if you think about a comic book, the way it shows a black-haired person with this blue highlight, right? That was Hector's hair. So Kianos meant lustrous. Chloros didn't mean green, it meant fresh, moist, like plants, you know, and on and on. So the turn to a primitive culture or an ancient culture, for me, simply reveals the proliferation of fantastic difference in humans' valuation of these experiences, right? So what we have is a certain equipment, and then we have neuroplasticity, and then we have the world that those were evolved to meet, and then the fun begins. That's my humble opinion.
And I don't really like the term primitive, because they're doing something really sophisticated. It's just different from what we're doing. And it's our challenge to try and figure out, using that contrast to figure out, well, what are the universal goals of this system, and then how are they deployable in different ways in different contexts?
Yeah. Did you have something to add? Okay. I want to make sure I'm looking to the sides of the room. Gentleman in the hat, it's advantageous to have these colorful and/or patterned accoutrement.
Yes, yes. Is this on? Yes. Okay, if you hold your, I'm going to talk about the fovea, or ask you rather about the fovea, but mainly I want to talk about, or get you to respond to perhaps, the concept that the brain many times doesn't see what the eye sees optically, and many times what the eye sees optically isn't seen by the brain. So a simple one is if you hold out your hand, then your thumbnail is about the size of the fovea, and you can show that the fovea is where all the high-resolution stuff is by holding it up, say, to a New York Times, and you'd see that only the letters by your thumb are in focus and the others aren't. But that doesn't work with color, and right now I'm looking at you, and everything in my periphery is color. And yet we know that the cones completely fall off in the periphery. It's supposed to be just the red rod, sensitive rods. So what's the thinking that's going on now that the image coming into the retina is not always what we see, and what comes into the retina, but often we don't see, as in many, many experiments that have shown.
I want Tauba to take it, because she talked us through that example about your peripheral vision.
I can't answer that.
I mean, I'll take a stab at it. So it's often said that your color vision is worse in the periphery, which I think is related to two things. Your color is worse in the periphery, and your visual acuity is better at the fovea, which is why you have to move your eyes from one place to the other. The acuity difference is true. The color difference is actually contentious. So people have argued, actually, that if you scale objects with visual acuity, your color perception in the periphery is pretty darn good. So in order to have that New York Times be legible in the periphery, you have to make the letters really big. If you make them really big, you got great color out there. The deeper question I think you were asking is about the way in which that visual information, think about one moment of light entering your eye, cast on the retina. That thing is used to keep busy tons and tons of neural tissue. It's like the optic nerve head is 1.5 millimeters in diameter, and we've got hundreds of millions of neurons who are kept occupied trying to figure out what's coming down that pike. And there are lots of ways of addressing that question, not the least of which I think is that at a certain point, our experience of vision is not retinally based. And you know this because if I present you with an object, my hand right now, that retinal image is very different than that retinal image. And yet, effortlessly, these things are both a hand. And in fact, they're both my hand. So there's some transformation that's taking place between a retinal basis, that is what our eye provides our brain to start with, and what our brains then digest that to be. And it's that sort of divide between what I call a retinal-based schema and a cognitive-based schema, where I think there's lots of very exciting work to be done that gets at the heart of your question. And right now, I don't think we have a very good idea about what that transformation is. People are struggling to think about it.
It's a way better answer than I would have given.
Okay. Yes?
Hi, I'm curious to hear more about the Amazon tribe you're looking at. Are they able to distinguish between different colors and the words they have for it? Sorry, 3 points. 2, do you have any information about people with blindsight and their relation to color? And then also, do you think the role of the different wavelengths in daylight inform us about our circadian rhythms? And how it is different in the morning to the afternoon.
Maybe we should group questions.
I think we should go back to Tauba's meditation exercise for this one, right? And get our circadian rhythms coordinated and humming together.
I don't really know about a color component to that, but I did recently read about some cave experiments wherein people were deprived of daylight for months at a time, and their rhythm universally stretched out. No one's got shorter. And a very common rhythm that people synced to was sort of a double time, like a 48-hour sleep-wake cycle. And Mitchell Sifra, I think I'm saying his name right, conducted this experiment on himself. And he intended to be in a cave for 2 months. And he would call the surface and count at what he perceived to be second intervals. And he started counting slower and slower and slower. And when his team came down to retrieve him after 2 months, he thought 1 had passed. So that doesn't say much about the color, but it does say something about the power of the light.
I'll just say, maybe we can meet afterwards, because you asked a lot of questions, and a lot of the data are unpublished, so I feel a little like it's not worth talking about here. Can I ask Hubel a question? I've been dying to ask.
You have the power of the podium.
At the microphone. Okay, so I think one of the fascinating things that's happening right in this sort of room is that, you know, we've got facts and we like dealing with facts. And so, you know, that breeds kind of next fact. What's the next fact? What I find fascinating about making art is that you don't start with any facts, or at least it doesn't seem like you do. You sort of start with some facts, but you actually end up in a way that in some ways is unpredictable from where you started. It's like you're given a set of things and then you end up over here. And that's the part that I'm like blown away by. And I would like to understand more about that process and what's happening, and whether or not there are things that you learn that are strategies that get you able to do that, to exploit the power of this perceptual cognitive apparatus, to be able to take what seems to me a completely nonlinear route from a set of starting propositions to an end point. And I mean,
I'll do my best to answer that. I mean, meditation is a part of cultivating that ability in myself. And I do feel like I start with facts. I'm interested in facts. I read about things, but just translating that information into an object, a painting, a photograph is not terribly interesting. Something else has to kick in at some point in order for it to become, in my opinion, worthwhile artwork. And I would just call that kind of stomach thinking that happens in the foam. And it's maybe like I spend a lot of time just trying to cultivate that state of mind, and I don't know if I have a sort of formula for how to do that because it's changing all the time. But I think that some kind of just purely visceral thinking has to kick in for me at some point. And I found that I was particularly freed in being able to do that when I started to work on those fold paintings and just go use a process by which I was going to paint and paint and paint and edit at the end. So I felt really free to just, I'm going to throw this color next to this color and then see if that just feels right. Like I'll know it when I see it, and then just trust that. So when I started to work that way and be a prolific producer and harsh editor, I found that was more possible for myself.
Does the sort of question that you have when you start the work change as well? The question that you have for yourself when you start the process ends up changing, or does the question remains?
Yeah, I think it's always changing, though I'm not necessarily knowing at the time.
I think it's interesting that both Alma and Taube, without having read each other's papers, went towards hypnagogic states and drug states, and there was this discussion. The humanists here all spoke about Wittgenstein and this fundamental existential question about whether my green is your green or my blue becomes your red, right? And at some level, it's fascinating that color induces that question. We don't ask if your triangle is my triangle. We don't ask if your reading the alphabet is the same as my reading the alphabet, right? We don't have these existential questions about that. So I think if we want to remember that Taube asked a question if anyone wanted to supply her with special kinds of drugs for color.
No, I want to make new drugs.
Right, she wants to make new drugs. It would be interesting to think about whether we would voluntarily take a drug so that we could see the colors that our partner saw, for example.
Definitely.
I would do that in a second. So,
well, you have an interesting partner.
Well, I do, but my father was colorblind. I gave that to my son, and yet, I get to see those colors, right? So I think that what we have identified is the existential and emotional mystery that we began with, and it's just tremendously exciting to see the work in all kinds of domains, philosophy, mathematics, art, neuroscience, that's chipping away at that without, back to your opening point, without diminishing the mystery, the joy, and the emotional attachment we have to this qualia. So I think we have time for one more question. Let's go to this side, which we haven't heard from yet.
So I think my question ties to your comment. While I listened to everybody talk, we heard three different ways of thinking of color. One as a fairly robust computational property. One as a language game, a property that emerges from a language game that might be tied to the computational property but might be culturally inflected. And the other, very different from a triangle, as a simple and unanalyzable property of phenomenal experience that can't be shared but can only be mentioned in some sort of way. And I wondered if the speakers found any sort of friction between these three different ways that people were speaking about them, or whether these all mesh together at different levels of our behavior or something like that.
That's a terrific question.
I don't feel friction.
I feel friction.
I think Bevel needs to do more meditating.
Yeah, no, I feel lots of friction. I feel friction in lots of ways. So I would start by saying I feel friction in the way in which we use language to mean very different things in different contexts. So I have to kind of give up something when I listen to Caroline talk about the way she thinks what I do. I mean, and this isn't an attack on Caroline. What this is there's some limitation in what it is that I've thought about that I can communicate, and that limitation seems to be almost a metaphor or metaphorized by color itself. It's like something about my ability to tell you something doesn't quite get across. And with language, we have this illusion that it seems to work, that I can tell you something and you're like, oh yeah, I get it. And with color, it's like, still stuck.
Yeah.
And that's my friction, because we're all using these words. And it's like, well, that's not, I don't think that's is that what I meant? I don't know, is that what
I guess I'm really interested in sort of where language drops off and things like color pick up. So that isn't an uncomfortable zone for me.
But you like those zones. You
right,
want to
exactly.
be at the interface.
Yeah. So I guess that explains why I don't feel that as as an uncomfortable like mismatch or something.
I don't like sailing. Maybe that's. I don't like sailing. I don't like
You
the
don't
water.
like the froth.
I don't like the froth.
Okay.
I don't like sailing either.
No, I'm just
We will exit and mingle out there, and we will empty this room for restaging for the keynote. And I really appreciate your attention and your questions. They were wonderful. Thank you.